get right into it. Joey, you have the first question.
Yeah, so the first question goes to Faris. So it's what does whole worker / tenant organizing mean to you, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, so I have kind of two ways of thinking about this. There's like a more theoretical way, and then I'll follow that up with the more practical idea. So this is really about class consciousness. You know, we as workers, we're people without large sums of wealth or capital at our disposal. We provide all of the labor that makes society function. We provide our labor, our blood, our sweat, our tears, and in return, we're gifted with housing insecurity, retirement insecurity, and precarious incomes. Meanwhile, those with access to capital are able to sit back and reap the rewards and the benefits of our labor without even lifting a finger. Organizing as a whole working class, viewing the bigger picture of the nature of this class war, is really the only way we can move forward on taking all of the things that we produce, all of the wealth. It's about building a world where people can actually live in dignity. Now, what this means more practically is talking to each other. Society atomizes us into sticking to our own groups, our own kind of social groupings, our own people that we're close with. And we need to break that up. We need to start talking to our co-tenants in our apartment buildings. We need to start talking to our co-workers who we normally wouldn't talk to. We need to build these connections in a methodical way. And we need to build our strength as a working class to push back against the bosses by using direct action. These are tools like strikes, sabotage, disruption, slowdowns, things like that.
Faris, I really, really appreciate that. I don't know if anyone who's been an active role in this panel or doing some whole worker organizing wants to speak on maybe some of how they've seen it change the organizing that you're doing. I know on the CTU, for example, has been doing a lot of work around that. All right. Well, we can see just really quickly if there's another question that's popped up in the chat. And if not, we can kind of move on to our second one if none of the other panelists have any thoughts they want to share. Yeah, Carrie, go.
Can I just add to that? Because I think Faris touched on a lot of things that I had been thinking about with this question around particularly the idea of organizing as a class and recognizing that we belong to a class. And I think the only thing I would add to what was so well said is also the idea of that there's no single issue struggle. And that's something Audre Lorde is very well known for saying around, you know, we don't live single issue lives. And for when we're doing, you know, organizing in workplaces or organizing with tenants, we have to recognize that the divisions that we often find within society amongst working class people are there to weaken our strength. And obviously our strength is in solidarity and united action and being able to come together across our differences to fight the real enemy. And so I think, you know, when I think of whole worker and tenant organizing, it's really about digging deep and building those relationships and making sure that when we're talking about how do we win against our bosses, how do we win against our landlords, that we're looking at who all is affected by this more broadly than just that single landlord or just that single boss, because a victory for workers in one workplace can be a victory for workers in all workplaces if they see that as an inspiration and a method for them to take up as well.
Can I just jump in for a second there?
Please.
Just the thought also that I think for a lot of people, or some people anyway, the workplace may not be the place where they have where there might not be the most transformative potential. You know, it might be that housing is the biggest issue in their lives at the moment, or it might be that racism in their community is the biggest thing in their lives at the moment. And that I think that labor struggles can be strengthened if we have strong community leadership. So.
Thank you so much, David. I really, really appreciate that. And I know in particular right now we're talking as well a lot about, you know, the tenants in labor, but I guess this can expand into more areas. but if there is any particular difference that you've thought of, or that you think is present between whole worker organizing and maybe this idea of whole tenant organizing, I'd love to hear that. But if you think it's largely similar, I'm also, yeah, just curious that's coming up. All right. If no one has anything more to add, we can move on to our second question, but I'll just check in with Gabby and Brian to see if there is any questions in the chat that we want to add up. And if not, we can move on to the second one.
I just got a direct question from Leslie.
Okay.
So Leslie says, as the people most often negatively impacted by housing crisis are rarely in unionized jobs, how is this project engage not just tenant groups, but groups of people with disabilities, seniors, other intersections, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And to open it up to the whole panel, I guess I'll ask how unions can also help bring the fight to folks who are currently not unionized, and protect both, job secure and secure workers right now. If anyone wants to hop in from sort of the union world.
Yeah, sure thing. I think, so I think like in the case of CTU, a couple of years ago, well, maybe about 10 now, probably predates me a little bit. But, there was I guess some tension in the union within like even organizing charter schools, right? So I think, Chicago is, one of these areas where the fight to, organize charter schools was kind of taken head on as well. And there was tension between, because there's tension between public schools and charters, right? But, I think, the union kind of understanding that, the only real way to prevent charter schools from expanding is to unionize charter school teachers. And so charter schools are, it's hard to, there are many things, right? So on one end, they're supposed to be, I guess, privately, run schools by different companies or organizations that have charters. However, they're also publicly funded. So, I think that's it's a very complex thing. But nonetheless, the issue around it is essentially, charter schools don't have any like unionized workers. However, in Chicago, a lot of the charter schools have been unionizing over the last couple of years. So, I think that's one angle, right, in terms of being in a union, is seeing that the criticalness of, organizing, workers who haven't been organized before. And I think in terms of like some of the other points that, the other panelists have been bringing up, I think it's about, for me, it's, folks seeing themselves, or at least in the context I'm in, a lot of times the workers and renters, they overlap, right? So, they are, for me, one and the same, right? So, yeah, I think it's about, really, understanding that, where we can get in and organize folks is key. A lot of times these issues overlap, right? As a teacher, my students not being able to be present in class physically or mentally could be due to them not having stable housing, right? And their families, kind of, floating from house to house, right? So I think it's about seeing all of these issues as being interconnected and impacting each other. Also in Chicago, had one of the largest school closings in the history, right? In history of the US. In 2012, the mayor closed 50 schools, right? That's unprecedented. And this also happened in communities that have been historically and systematically displaced, right? In Black and Latinx communities throughout Chicago. So, I think it's about understanding, those similarities and those links. And then where folks think that these issues are kind of operating in their own silos, as a labor organizer, but then also as a teacher and a tenant organizer, trying to make those links and create spaces for those intersections to happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Does anyone have anything else they want to add on this particular topic? Okay, cool. I can ask the next question. And funny enough, this is also directed at you, Jonathan. So sorry to make you speak twice in a row. But can you maybe tell us one success story? And if you have it as well, maybe one horror story of cross-movement work between both, the labor movement and tenants, or any other type of cross-movement work that you might want to bring up? And what are some lessons in teaching that you took from these stories?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. But yeah, I think the 2019 strike was a really big, example of that, where a lot of our demands, although some of our demands were more teacher related, a lot of them weren't, right? A lot of them were about having restorative justice, coordinators, right, in our school buildings. A lot of them were about, having housing advocates in the school buildings, right? Folks who have, they have a paid position to be a housing advocate, not, tacking it on to a teacher or some other, person to kind of try to juggle all these other responsibilities, but, having a person that was hired specifically for that. And those were things that we had in the contract, and, we fought for it and won, right? So, now, not all schools have them, right? You know how they're going to do it. They're going to slowly implement it, and okay, these 5 schools can get it now, and then we'll see how it goes. But I think it just shows that once we apply that pressure, what it is that we can get. I think in terms of horror stories, I wouldn't say it's a horror story, but I do think obviously because of all of the different legalese and all these different things, even though we can fight in the contract, what we can get sometimes is limited as well, right? So we couldn't get those, I don't know exactly how many schools there are in CPS, but if there's 200, we couldn't get 200 housing advocates, in the schools, right? So I think those would kind of be the horror stories in which, those limitations that kind of can get put on movements when they happen. And I would say the lessons for that is, how do we, and I think that, we did a good job of it, but I think you can always do better, right? How do we make the community see these issues as their own, right? How do we get the community, because a lot of the issues in the contract that, Chicago's teachers union was fighting for were community issues. However, we obviously, right, could have did a much better job of getting even more folks in the community as seeing that as their fight. So for me, it's about thinking, how do we do that, right? And some of that's already happening, right? Partnering with different community organizations. But then I think, how we brainstorming about even more community organizations to be a part of, whether it be the Lift the Ban coalition in Chicago, which CT was a part of, and also the Chicago tennis movement as well, right? How do we get involved in these different things to, give even more of a platform to these issues?
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, does anyone else want to jump in? I know, Carrie, with the BCGEU, you both are government-related unions, and there might be some overlap there.
I was thinking about this, and I think, one of the things that comes to my mind when I think about our successes in doing some cross-movement work is the successes that happened in Burnaby when we worked with Acorn BC, and huge credit to Acorn BC and Murray Martin for a lot of the on-the-ground work they did, talking to tenants in buildings and really bringing the issue to light of the basically the mass evictions of working class tenants in these purpose-built rental buildings in Burnaby in the Metrotown area, and just demolishing those buildings to replace them with luxury condos. Thousands of renters being displaced over the years. And we got involved with them, and they had already been doing this work. And I think, when we came in, we were really concerned about what was going on, and the fact that this city council, which claimed to be progressive, was the mayor and council was not acting in the interests of working people. And we reached out to our members to highlight the issues that Acorn BC was talking about, and did you know, some research to support the work that they were doing, and really just highlighted the real injustices that were happening, and managed to not only evict the mayor from his position and bring in a mayor who explicitly, you know, supported protecting these tenants, but also were part of the process with them in developing some of the best tenant protections that we've seen in a long time, from dem evictions in particular. And I think, you know, that was a lesson in really working across broad sections of working class people, and bringing people together on things that we have in common, building relationships within the community, and seeing the real power that has in terms of shifting the not only, you know, public opinion, but also the political will to address some of these issues, which I think is only a small part of the solution. I think even with the political winds changing, there's always a need to organize and fight for more and to strive for more, and that work, I think, needs to continue. But for us, that was a big lesson, and one of the bigger successes that we've seen.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Sarah, your mic off for a reason, or mic on for a reason, or is that?
Yeah, I can just something that you said, Terry, sparked a real experience that we had in Alberta. We had 44 years of conservative government, and then many decades of a different party conservative government before that. For the first time, we elected a supposed Labour Party into power, and the biggest mistake that Labour and activists in general made was laying down. That was across the board. It was a universal experience where basically the left, and I'm not just talking about the left that's affiliated with the NDP. There were a lot of activists who just, in very subtle ways, didn't want to rock the boat too hard. That was the biggest mistake that we could have ever made. It led to a government that acted in many ways more right-wing than previous conservative governments. And it really sent the signal to the ruling class in general that Labour is going to relax under these times, and that now is the time that you can take more. It was a huge error, and I think a lot of people in this province learned from it. So this is just one experience that I think anyone who ends up in a place where they elect a supposedly Labour, Social Democratic, or progressive government needs to keep pushing
them. Just to say a little bit, I was going to use the ACORN and BCGU as the example as well, in terms of in BC here of a quite amazing win, like the best tenant protections that I've seen, and hats off to Carrie and to Murray, particularly in their work on that. And just like as a broad kind of observation, 10 years ago in the kind of activist circles that I move around, conversations about working with labor unions and close kind of work with labor unions just was not happening at all. And that was, I think that's quite a big change. I think that there's still some room to go in terms of building relationships, and we're starting to, I'm starting to see more of that kind of work where we're showing up for each other's events, and we're, starting to kind of support each other in terms of policy and stuff like that. But I also think like those kinds of projects where we're actively kind of collaborating and working together are really encouraging to see.
Yeah, this is cool. Does anyone have, anyone of the panelists have anything that they want to add in? Maybe we can see if there's any questions from the chat that have popped up, either Gabby or Brian, that you want to speak up and let folks know. I'm seeing that there's a lot in there.
Yeah, I've seen kind of Oh, can you guys hear me? I've seen a theme between Earl and like Maz kind of asking about how we can use the connections between labor and tenant organizing to reach out to even other marginalized communities, such as racialized groups. There was questions about disabled groups. There was questions about gig economy workers, and like ways that this solidarity could reach out to other groups that aren't classically part of either of these organizations.
Does anyone have any thoughts?
This actually kind of, can I like use this and go into the next question?
Sure, yeah.
Because the next question, not to steal your moderating, but why is it necessary for, oh, surprise, we got the questions ahead of time. Why is it necessary for renters and workers specifically to work together, which I think also kind of ties into these questions that have been raised in the chat around how this can also go into building connections and working with groups that may not be particularly involved in or touched on by unions. And I think this is where, you know, we also have to recognize in BC, I don't know about Alberta or Illinois, but only 30% of workers have a union in BC. We are not the majority of workers here. And I think for us to recognize that, you know, there are very real reasons, and anyone who organizes workplaces will tell you why, like, it's so difficult for workers to unionize and to even you know, bring that number up. But I think that also goes to show, like, we can't just focus on unionized workers and tenant solidarity. The vast majority of renters are workers, and the definition of worker and working class that I use, it includes people who are unemployed, on disability, and those sorts of things, because they still rely on you know, the state and those sorts of things in order to earn a living. And they don't rely on the labor of others to make a profit and invest into further profits. So they are workers and working class. Sorry for the tangent. But so housing is one of the areas in which workers are also exploited, not just the workplace. And so this is another area where we need to find common ground across our artificial divides to build that power. Organizing to shift the balance of power to tenants and away from landlords, away from the owning class is incredibly important and necessary. We see the dynamic in housing where collectively tenants have more power than the landlord, because the landlord relies on their rents for their profit. They rely on a docile and afraid tenant to exploit them and to exploit them further and to replace them if they get to be too unruly on their own as an individual, to evict them and to bring in someone else. And so that collective power is really important in terms of actually being able to win real changes. And even for homeowners, you know, you're paying rent to the bank and they're profiting off of those mortgages. And so I think it's important for us to highlight that here. And so if we were to take just looking at organizing workers in workplaces, if you're winning a wage increase, which is a material benefit and one of the main reasons people will organize, and you win a wage increase through collective struggle, you then see that larger share of income go to pay your rent or increases in your housing costs, and that victory is quite limited. And so we know that in this way, it's really short-sighted to only organize in this one way. And for us to recognize that workers across this province, whether they're in a union or not, we all need to be organized in order to make significant changes, and not just minor gains such as, you know, a wage increase or stopping a rent increase, but also to fundamentally change the power dynamics and what the idea of housing even looks like. That, you know, we change what the vision of housing is through this collective struggle. And I appreciated what John put in the chat around, you know, often laying down after we win a victory, is that's when we've built enough momentum that we need to really push for more. And I think, you know, when we think about some of the folks who were mentioned in the chat around people with disabilities or racialized groups, like that's still the vast majority of people who are in, you know, precarious tenant situations, precarious work situations. And by reaching out to build those relationships and to build that collective power, you know, we're bringing more people into the movement than just the 30% who are in a union, or the couple, like the small buildings that we've got organized and those sorts of things. And so it's this vision that we're all part of actually advancing this struggle. And in fact, many folks, I've been doing some organizing with tenants, and a significant number of them are seniors and people on disability, and they're leading the fights in the organizing. And so if we're stepping outside of, you know, the usual realms we might work within and really reaching out to communities to talk to people and build those relationships, then they quite easily kind of come into the fold and become part of that movement.
Thank you, Carrie. Wow, yeah, an amazing response. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to add in there?
Just something really quickly. You know, if we're asking ourselves why is it important that tenants and workers should have solidarity, or why marginalized groups or why other you know, supposedly disparate groups should have solidarity, the answer is because the bosses do. You know, we're fed this load of crap that we should all be individualistic and cut each other at the knees to get ahead. But the people who are telling us this, they're the people at the top. They're the people with the wealth, with the resources. And here's something that they don't want us to know, is that they cooperate, they collaborate, and they conspire together better than we do. The wealthy and the business community are constantly working together to further their interests. And they take more and more and more from us every time they do. They understand solidarity and they use it. And it's about time we do too. Property developers, employers, and other groups representing the side of capital work hand in hand to push their interests.
And if I can add really quickly, one of my mentors once told me, like, when you see a good fight, you better get in it, right? And so I think, you know, sometimes I run myself ragged, right? Trying to be 15 million places at once, but I also think, you know, it's very key, right? And it's very essential. It's essential as, you know, an educator, right? As a person in a labor union, to also see, you know, I have friends who are partaking in the effort to organize folks in the informal economy, right? So this is the folks who, I'm not sure about the context of other cities, but in Chicago, you know, folks who selling loose squares, right? Loose cigarettes and doing all these things, right? How do we, you know, organize, you know, those folks, and then, you know, also build that solidarity. And I think, you know, in terms of making that connection with tenant organizers, you know, for me, I think it's going back to, you know, a lot of times, you know, my students bring this into the classroom, right? They bring this, right? This lived experience of housing insecurity, you know, into the classroom. So as an educator, you know, I see it as my duty to be, you know, be involved in, you know, fighting, you know, against, you know, those conditions. So.
I just wanted to share a quick example from New West about how the real estate lobby and the developers organize very quickly and come quick when there's a threat to their interests. In 2019, there were 6 buildings, about maybe 600 units, where they were all stratified, which means at any moment the landlords could sell them off into condos. And this had happened in a small building, but the city council decided to create a bylaw which essentially would make it rental-only zoning. So in the developers' minds, that essentially is like down zoning. And very quickly, Landlord BC, UDI, all of the suits came out to that event. There's probably more than actually came out to the renoviction bylaw. There was about 20 or 25 suits that came out to that event. And luckily, we didn't really think it was going to be such a big deal, but luckily we had organized tenants to come out to that. And we at least had some speakers ready to point out that housing is a human right and you can't just take these people's homes away. So, yeah, why do we need worker and tenant solidarity? Because they're very much organized and they're intransigent, and we need as much power as we can to have real concrete gains. So.
Thank you, David. I'll maybe just do a quick ask of Gabby and Brian if there's any questions in the chat or that someone might want to bring up.
Leslie asked to have a direct response to this last topic. I'm not too sure what her question is, but Leslie?
Leslie, are you there? You might be on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, my name's Leslie, and I'm involved with the Victoria Tenant Action Group. And I personally have started my tenant activism in 1975 when I got a big notice of rent increase in my first apartment. Ferris mentioned changes in government in Edmonton spurring changes in law. And in the mid-70s in Ontario, when we were calling for the first rent controls, when we were calling for protection against eviction in the law, we heard about the solidarity movement in BC. And we were actually, me and my friends made a flyer, and we distributed 15,000 of them, saying, if we had laws in Ontario like they had in BC, then we would have tenant rights and we'd have protection against big rent increases. And we heard about this thing called the solidarity movement. And I don't know I don't have a clear recollection of when that was or who of you might have been alive then, but it felt to me like a great, big, incredible mass people's movement for, and tenant rights and labor rights were definitely there. I became a tenant rights advocate in Ontario when around the late 80s, when the charter was being rewritten for the last time. There was a big push from a lot of interests to include private property rights in the charter. And a coalition was formed, actually started by a pretty organized tenant movement in Ontario, but included environmentalists, Indigenous organizations and representation, farmers, laborers, and women. And we were able to, we were promoting social and economic rights being included, which we didn't achieve, but we did achieve removing private property rights from that charter. And it feels to me like there's relationships between labor and tenants to build, and definitely parallels, particularly around negotiating and bargaining. But it also feels to me like there's a greater coalition opportunity right now in BC around rights about the earth, rights about earth and people, and ownership of earth and people. And landlords say they own the land, and we know they don't, and Indigenous people tell us they don't. And I believe that there's an opportunity for coalitions to be built about how earth and people are treated. And to me, that covers tenants, and it covers labor, and it covers people with disabilities, and it covers environmental interests, and it certainly covers negotiating with First Nations about land rights. And so I just wanted to contribute that to the conversation. I really have been appreciating, Harry, the breadth of experience that BCGEU and has had around housing and tenant rights, and by actually working with people and knocking on apartment doors. Yeah, so I wanted to put my 2 cents worth in. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Does anyone on the panel have anything they want to say in response to that statement? And I can also clarify one, thank you, Leslie, for bringing that up. If folks are interested in hearing more about Operation Solidarity, I can post a link in the chat to an article about it. I gave a brief summary, but it was a coalition between renters, workers, and other community groups that at its height had 1 in 10 workers that were on strike across the province, and threatened to have 1 in 3 workers on strike across the province. It threatened to topple the entire government in BC in the 1980s. That was a pretty far right government. Ultimately, it ended in some bitter feelings, but I think had a lot of wins as well. If no one on the panel has any response or any comment they want to make right now, we can also move on to the next question, which I think Joey, you're gonna take on.
Yeah, for sure. So okay, so this is a pretty good transition. So the National Education Union in Manchester has done some amazing work bridging our movements in some creative ways, from tenant committees inside of labor unions to solidarity motions that funnel union workers into their local tenant union. So the question is, and this is for David, what are some concrete ways labor can support tenants and vice versa in an ideal future? And where do you see our joint movements going with that?
Thank you. So I guess for me, just like a personal history, I've been different groups in the left searching, looking, trying to find those, those techniques and organizing methods and mentorship and like all of those kinds of things, that kind of community of people that are really trying to share what they've learned from past experiences. And I think it's sometimes it feels like groping around in the dark and trying to find things that work, and you can learn a lot from other cities and internationally, but there's nothing that really beats direct, mentorship, one-on-one work, and really like learning what, the inside details of like what it takes to organize. And I think in some ways, some of those methods and techniques are kind of like leaking out into other organizations now. But I still think that there's a lot that that activists and organizers outside can learn from labor unions that really have got this right and really know how to organize. And we have a lot of different skills too, but I think one thing that I'm really keen about is looking at something like labor community organizer training. I think a place where organizers can come and learn about past struggles, but also make connections so that they can get advice and learn about how they can improve their organizing, because it's the most challenging thing that I've ever done. I think it challenges every single aspect of yourself, intellectually and emotionally and everything else. And I think we need that kind of community in order to be able to really grow. So anything in that direction, I think would be amazing.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'll open it up if anyone on the panel might want to chime in about some ways that they see, potential tenant labor solidarity actually concretely looking like in your unions. And this is when we can leave a bit of silence if folks need to think on, because I think it's an important
one. I think there's also a really good example in the chat that Sean put up about a way that Parkdale organizers called on government employee workers, social service workers, not to process eviction orders and things like that. So I thought I'd just throw that as an example for you guys to think about concrete ways that this could look.
Yeah, I want to bring up Parkdale too, and that's a great example. Another example of Parkdale is, okay, so going back to this idea of what concretely it looks like for tenant and kind of established union solidarity. It's, the reality is trainings would be great. Give trainings on how to organize, give trainings to train people to train others on how to organize. And also, it's not just a one-way street of established unions to, the tenants movement. While, business unions may have a lot of money, the tenants unions don't, and that's great. Resources is always helpful. The reality is that tenants unions have one thing that business unions don't, or business labor unions don't. And that's an absolute necessity to organize as a function of existing. So there are many business unions that are forgetting how to organize because they can kind of sit back and rely on a bloated bureaucracy to function for them. And I can tell you right now that the tenant organizers in Parkdale right now, many of whom are not in unions, have never been in unions, they could teach a master class on organizing that many people in the labor movement would barely know anything about.
Yeah, and I think in Chicago, what that's looked like is just a lot of like coalition building and being a part of the different coalitions that are happening and supporting, where we can, whether it be, people power with canvassing, people power with, making phone calls, I think things like that. So in Chicago, there's kind of two big housing kind of campaigns going on. So one is called the Lift the Ban campaign, which the state of Illinois has a ban on rent control. And so, there's a lot of fights around that. And then also there's like these moratoriums since the pandemic began. There's been a moratorium that's been kind of expanded like every month, but there's been like a moratorium on evictions. And so I think, there's different coalitions that have been a part of that and fighting to make sure, one, that the moratorium on eviction stays, particularly during COVID, but then also this ban on rent control. So, I think it's really, in terms of how it's played out in Chicago, supporting those different coalitions, being a part of them, but then also supporting them, mobilizing membership if necessary in terms of eviction defense and things like that, which is, things that have had to happen as well. Yeah. So, that's kind of how that's looked like in Chicago at times.
Can I just add, I just wanted to add to that too, because we've definitely been working on training and education and connecting experiences organizing as a tenant to organizing in the workplace, as well as organizing in the workplace to organizing as tenants. And obviously there's much more that needs to be done around that. And just to the point of like bringing in workers who are directly part of these like systems and institutions that are, what tenants are coming up against and struggling against. And I think one of the things I wanted to mention was around just how much risk it takes for workers to defy their bosses and getting people to the point where they're willing to take those risks because the situation necessitates it, because they understand kind of the consequences of not doing that are much worse than the consequences they could possibly face. And the only thing I would say to doing that and to achieving that is really bringing workers and tenants together to build those relationships and to build that trust amongst each other and to understand kind of the situation and what it calls for. Because I think, for a lot of workers who especially are on the front lines, whether it's the residential tenancy branch or housing support workers, or even people who work in other parts of the community where they're directly seeing the impacts, if not experiencing it themselves, seeing the impacts on the people that they serve and that they work with. I think it's important for us to recognize that you don't just immediately think like, I need to risk everything in order to change this. Like that needs to be fostered, that needs to be a consciousness that worker comes to through directly working with not only folks like tenants in the community, but also other workers in the workplace, and understanding like, what can we do? What power do we have? And what can we do to change things?
Ben, you're muted.
You're muted.
All I was saying was thank you so much, Carrie. I think that for those very wise words. Does anyone else have things that they want to say in response, or maybe I can ask if there's a question in the chat. Brian or Gabby?
I can chime in really quickly. We have a question about if folks have thoughts about the changes in organizing during the pandemic and not being able to meet people where they work or live. If there are strategies that you folks have found effective during this time. And then there was also an earlier question about organizing tenants not in apartment buildings. So kind of some questions around like strategies for reaching folks, if anyone has any thoughts.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, anyone want to jump in? Yeah, Carrie, go for it.
Just on the first question around organizing during the pandemic, because I've been doing meetings over Zoom with some tenants, and obviously it's a real struggle to kind of do sort of the real like connecting with people door to door. But we've been consistently using Zoom as a platform to meet and discuss and identify like if they can phone people or if they have contact information for other people around them that they can utilize, or if you see people, if you can have kind of a distanced conversation. And I mean, it's also been a bit of a challenge because I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'm a lot of these people are seniors and people who aren't necessarily the most tech savvy. And so, I think it's been a real important lesson in recognizing that if people want things to change, if they're organizing, they will find ways to make it work. They will find ways to meet with people, and they'll find ways to talk to people. And the pandemic has created a lot of challenges in terms of respecting people's comfort levels and risks to their health in terms of being able to talk to people in person. But I think it's also opened up a recognition that there is a real imperative and a willingness for folks to be doing this. And if you can find ways to facilitate that, whether it's through providing a paid Zoom account, like I've set up a regular meeting that they can use. And so that's one way to kind of help facilitate this, but really getting creative in how to approach these things. I know others have done actions and things like that, so I don't want to take up too much space.
David, I don't know if you have anything, or John, yeah, you want to hop in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, like Carrie was saying, I'm sure everybody's zoomed out. So we've been, we've been, using a lot of Zoom as well. I think other, strategies, this is probably the most phone banking I've ever done in my life, right? But then, I think also, I have, some organizer friends that are a lot, way more tech savvy than me and have found different apps that can like send out different text messages and things like that. But, there also have been cases where we have had to, go make a plan to go into buildings, right? I'm also part of kind of formulating another organization which on the Chicago South Side, which is predominantly Black. And yeah, in that case, we've had to either use our different, our mutual aid, food distribution, things to kind of be a makeshift meeting space. But then also, in some cases we have had to, to the best of our ability, given, the pandemic, we've had to, set up different meetings with people in person. So, and, that might mean, social, outside, social distancing. You all are in Canada, so, the weather's pretty the same, right? We're pretty cold here as well. So, the winter has kind of made things complicated. But yeah, I think, and that, that's where Zoom and stuff comes in. So, I think there's these different things. you know, that technology does afford us. But then there are these moments where we do have to, you know, physically, you know, try to be present and take our necessary precautions. You know, for folks who have disabilities as well, right? So we are in a process of trying to organize a building that has a high population of folks who are disabled. And that's a building that right now we're trying to strategize, you know, how do we meet with them potentially, you know, in person and do that safely, so.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. And I'm seeing Carrie also posted in the chat about having a 2-hour meeting the other night with tenants who are mostly seniors working from 5 a.m. to 6 p.m. How to protect the community from eviction. So that's wild. Oh my gosh, Carrie. Must have been a tough call. If no one has more to add on that point, we can hop into our next question. Let me just switch back into that document. Right, okay, this one's a little bit of a longer one, so I hope hang in there, and I promise we'll get to the end of it. So it starts off by saying, Professor David Dorey out of York University recently published an article titled "The Striking Absence of Freedom of Association in Landlord and Tenant Law," in which he's quoted as saying, quote, "The model of freedom of association in landlord and tenant law seems entirely out of step with freedom of association jurisprudence. Landlord and tenant law shares with labor law a basic recognition that the relationship it governs is often defined by inequalities in economic power." He then goes on to propose the question, is landlord and tenant law the next frontier for the fight for union rights? This question is to Ferris, which is, how do you think the achievement of collective bargaining rights has changed things for the labor movement? And what do you think it could do for renters if we had the same?
I love that I get this question. To be quite honest with you, the legal protections for collective bargaining rights in this country are a joke.
Yep.
They only, and it's not a coincidence that where your organizing power ends is precisely where your rights end. Even if in the law it says you have more rights, don't worry. The courts, the cops, and the legislators will trample all over that in a heartbeat. Don't worry about that. Look, I think we should view the creation of a legal framework similar to what exists for labor for tenants with some nuance and some complexity. One of the biggest lessons the labor movement has learned is that not all laws, even the ones that look good, even the ones that we celebrated, turned out to be all that great. Many come with strings attached or ties your movement to a feckless bureaucracy that hamstrings your power. That's really what it comes down to. Instead of viewing the law as an opportunity to provide paternalistic protections that make us think the burden of organizing can be lessened, we should think precisely the exact opposite and ask ourselves, do these laws help increase our power or do they potentially diminish it? And I'm not saying that all laws diminish it. I'll give you an example of one that doesn't, is kind of what you mentioned, freedom of association. So an example of a group of laws that help workers build their power is around freedom of association. In the United States, is called protected concerted activity. And it's much stronger in the United States than it is here. And this is a protection for workers to engage in activities for the purposes of collective bargaining, mutual aid, or protection. This would be amazing in the context of tenant organizing. And then on the flip side, an example of a law that would diminish our power would be what we have in the labor movement in some instances called compulsory binding arbitration, where the state or the government steps in and forces both parties to accept a final deal with a quote unquote neutral third party. Many in the labor movement, especially in the context of a first contract, view this as a good thing because it gives the union a shortcut to getting a deal. While this may be true, this is a direct threat to your ability to build working class power. We need to ask ourselves, do we want quick and easy wins and keep the machine turning? Or do we want to build a militant working class powerful enough to take on and overthrow a system that throws so many of us into the meat grinder? That's how we should look at the question of legal recognition and protection. The laws that build our power, great, let's go for them. The ones that diminish it, no thanks.
Thank you, Ferris, for a very, very, very great nuanced response. Does anyone want to jump in with their thoughts as well? David, coming from a tenant's perspective, if you have any thoughts that you'd love to share, I would love to hear them.
Sure. I mean, I think, not having a labor background and not, fully understanding collective bargaining rights, get somewhat at a disadvantage in terms of really kind of seeing how that might play out and how it plays out in labor. But just, just from practical experience, one of the things that was very challenging for our organization is dealing with RTB cases all of the time, and dealing with landlord threats and bad faith evictions, and the legal side of fighting rent evictions, having to make cases and becoming experts in building construction. It's the courts really are completely stacked against the tenant to be able to fight large rent eviction cases. It's really challenging. So anyway, for me, I think anything that can keep our eyes focused on building tenant power and forcing landlords to agree to things that work in our favor and not dragging it through the courts, I think the better for us.
Thank you, David. Carrie, did you want to jump in before? I saw you had turned your mic on.
Yeah, I fully agree and support with what the previous two people have said. And I just wanted to kind of connect this to collective bargaining wasn't necessarily fought for in the way that I think a lot of people may come to think it has been. It was more of a compromise. And even in, say, the BCGU's history, when we first became the Provincial Civil Service Association in 1919, there were no laws to unionize, to be recognized legitimately by the employer. And we didn't have collective bargaining rights, but workers, came together, and the purpose of their organizing was to improve their living and working conditions and to bring more control to the workplace into the workers' hands. They collected dues themselves. They would go to workers and be like, hey, time to collect dues. And because this was before the RAND formula. And I think, there's a lot to be said for what people will do when they're committed to solidarity and the principles of collective power. And I would encourage people to look up, some of this history, particularly Order in Council PC 1003. I can put that in the chat for people to look up. But I think, this is a major piece of labor legislation that came into effect not as kind of this big celebratory victory, which, established kind of the legal right for unions in Canada, but actually diminished a lot of the power workers had because they were now bound to the terms of a collective agreement. It gave the clause that we all see in our collective agreements for management rights. And this basically also created legitimate unions and illegitimate unions within Canada. And so suddenly you had to be tied to this entire legalistic framework in order to even be legitimized in the eyes of court and to have the very limited protections that workers get under a union contract. And so I fully want to second and lift up what Ferris said about the lack of protections, particularly concerted protected activity for workers who want to take collective action. And really, this is, I think, a lesson that renters and tenant organizers can take from the labor movement is fight, if you want to fight for collective bargaining, do that, but do it as a means to an end and not as an end in itself. And it could be just as easy for tenant unions to become as bureaucratic and top down as trade unions if tenants aren't consciously building their movement to counter this. And one of my hopes is that workers who get involved in tenant organizing take those lessons back to their unions and democratize and build that power from the shop floor up so that, we're kind of co-working together in this way, because I think there's a real limit if we envision the law as the framework that we want to fit into, and recognize that we need to go beyond what they're willing to permit to demand what we truly ought to have in this world.
Wow. Yeah. If that isn't one of the highlight quotes of the panel, a means to an end, not an end to itself. Thank you so much, Carrie. Are there any questions from the chat at this point that that we want to highlight, either Gabby or Brian?
I saw comments about militancy, including like tactics that we could use. There was like an idea about squatting, I guess. So some thoughts about that from the panel. And then there was another one about like remote areas, so non-urban organizing and how we could reach out to folks that live in like the rural areas or places that wouldn't be natural allies or easy to organize, or people in conservative areas or things like that.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah. Any thoughts from the panelists that want to jump in? Ferris.
Yeah, I organize in rural Alberta. I'm some of the most, you know, as voting goes, some of the most conservative, most right-wing places. But what I've found is that that's not really the whole story. So the reality of the situation is, I think that the actual number of people who understand the kind of political spectrum, the political parties, and the way our government's politics operates is actually a lot smaller than we think. I think most people conceive of politics as like team sports, as like, you know, this is my party because this is what my community says I should vote for. That's for the most part. Where people's politics actually matters more to them is in their communities. So I go into these places in rural Alberta that are, you know, people think of as the most right-wing places on the planet. And I go in and they've elected, you know, 90% voting for the most right-wing person in the UCP, the United Conservative Party, as their elected official. And I'll go into a community meeting, which is made up of people of all political stripes. And they have posters on their wall of how they got their hospital, which was women in the community banded together, had a caravan to the county office, barricaded themselves inside that county office and demanded public health care. Like, there is a history of people fighting for public services, for power in their communities that is totally divorced from their political affiliation. People are self-interested. They care about themselves and they care about their communities, and they're willing to fight for it regardless of their political affiliation. So I think one of the biggest lessons for me has been, when I go to rural Alberta, I'm not going there to tell you who to vote for. Honestly, I don't really care, because sometimes it's the loudest, the loudest, most aggressive organizers, you know, they vote conservative. And maybe over time, getting involved and seeing the political kind of system on a bigger level will change that, and maybe it won't. But that's not really what matters to me.
Thank you, Ferris. Any thoughts from other panelists? Okay. Yeah, Joey, do you want to, I know we're running a little bit over time, but we got one more question. Joey, do you want to hop in and do the last one here?
Sure. Okay. This one is for John. This is the last question. So the question is, can you touch on what your experience has been like organizing renters and workers? And what are the similarities and lessons you think on that? And can you touch on the power? I think
it's like living near the beach chairs.
Someone's got their microphone on.
Sure thing. I think I was just having this conversation a little bit earlier. I think one of the main lessons from both is just, I guess, yeah, how much polarizing, you know, we have to do. You know, I think in both situations, you know, I remember when we went on strike in 2019, you know, a large part of that was, you know, having to polarize, you know, the membership, obviously, you know, because when you're talking about, you know, a union, even in a lefty, you know, progressive union like CTU, I mean, there's still like a active right wing, you know, in it, right, of teachers, right? And so I think, you know, leading up to this strike, you know, really having to have, I was one of the teachers who was going out knocking on other teachers' doors and like telling them, hey, we're about to go on strike. Where do you stand? Right? because this is what we're going to try to do. And, I think so, that was a really big learning lesson for me is, polarizing, but just even the necessity of it, right? Because me, typically, I'm kind of timid in those situations, but understanding like, we were getting ready to go up, in this battle against the mayor, and that, we kind of, we had to have, we had to be strong and had to be united. And then also like, when you have these conversations, right, we're talking about how folks are self-interested, and then having these conversations, maybe, the issue isn't restorative justice, right, for one teacher, but, having 50 kids in the class is, right. And so, okay, well then is that something you're willing to strike over and fight over, right? And bring those, bringing that unity there on that. And I think it's kind of been similar with housing organizing. We're just having a meeting earlier where with this group we've just, sorry if I'm getting hoarse, with this group we've just created. And so, kind of going through those growing pains and, a lot of the tenants that we're starting to talk to are kind of like, you know what, we're just over this. We just gonna move, right? We're not really trying to deal with none of this. We're just trying to move. And I think for, that's been discouraging, for some of us, particularly some of the newer organizers coming around. But, I think even in those situations, trying to figure out ways, how do we still, polarize, right? And not polarizing in the same way of like, you either with the union or you're not, right? But polarizing in the context of, in terms of Chicago, where this, this systematic plan of gentrification, like it's really ruthless right now. And just kind of polarizing folks around like, no matter where you live, move in this city as a Black person, like you're not gonna have much better housing, right? So we have to kind of, this is where the buck has to stop, right? This is where we have to kind of, prepare to go up against, city administration, these different landlords or, whatnot. And so I think, figuring out how do we polarize, around that, because, a lot of these issues we're seeing, right, that we can't escape them. We can't escape, these issues. We can't escape housing discrimination. We can't escape, extremely high rents. We can't escape these things, right? And so at some point, we're going to have to fight back, right? And so I think polarizing, around that. So I would say those are kind of the lessons that I've been learning is, how do you do that, but also doing that in a very as empathetically as possible, right? Understanding that there are, actual limitations, in this. And I think, just figuring out where we can push those limitations when we can.
Thank you, John. Yeah, does anyone on the panel have anything they want to contribute, want to hop in and talk a little bit about some of the similarities between doing the both? I know, Ferris, for example, you've done some organizing in buildings as of recent, as well as are doing a lot of labor organizing as well. If you have any thoughts on some of the similarities there.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities, and I think one of the biggest ones is don't look to activists or the leftist community. Like I think that's the biggest lesson here is that when we kind of had a boom in tenant organizing take off at the start of the pandemic, there were kind of two types of people who were interested. There were people who were tenants in buildings who legitimately couldn't pay their rent or were worried about their neighbors who couldn't. And then there were activists who saw rent strike and were like, oh, that sounds really cool. Let's do that. The training is, okay, so here, go out, talk to your neighbors in your building, build strength, agitate, educate, organize, like get this going to the point where you can collectively attempt to negotiate a rent decrease with your property manager. And the tenants who came, they got it right away. Oh, I need to talk to my neighbors to organize. The same training would be given to like leftists and activists, and they'd be like, talk to my neighbors. What if I made a poster? I mean, could I make a Facebook event? How about like a website? Do we need a board of directors? What are we gonna do for fundraising? And I'm just like, whoa, like, could you just talk to your neighbors? And it, yeah. Don't get too bogged down in the leftist community and focus on organizing people.
Yeah. Thank you, Ferris. David, I'm assuming you have similar feelings. Awesome. Do we have any questions in the chat, Gabby or Brian, that we want to flag?
I'd love to add something too, if we. Yeah.
Oh yeah, please.
Just that I think a lot of the organizing is very similar, and just from my experience in the last couple of years, like when our organization first started, within a week we were in 3 different buildings fighting 3 different fights, basically. And I think there was just 2 of us essentially. So it was very fast, and we found seniors, people on disability, like packing boxes, basically just on the say-so of their landlord. And so, there's lots of great online tenant education resources and all that kind of stuff, and that is not going to get to a lot of people. So absolutely, Ferris, like the door-to-door knocking, just in terms of tenant education, is really huge. People, if anybody is afraid of door knocking, it's like 99% of people that I door knock on are really happy to see me. Like there's nobody that slams in, the door in my face. It's very small. Because people, if you can show that you're actually there to really help people, and it's something that they care about, then they're going to be happy that you're there. So anyway, education, I think, is really important at the door, but also in organizations. And I think in the same way with labor unions, what we did have to run up against was the kind of understanding that a union is an insurance company, like we'll pay our dues, and when shit goes wrong, then we'll come to you and you'll fix our problems. And those ideas we really have to fight against those ideas, and build leadership and build agency, so that people understand that, like the only things that we can, without their participation, without them taking leadership, we can't really do anything. Like I'm doing this on the side of another job, and so all the power lies in building that collective power. So, but having tenants understand that takes a lot of education and a lot of work and a lot of infrastructure too.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Carrie.
Just to add, and I noticed in the chat there was a comment about calling tenant advocates and landlords have the right, and they stop fighting when they don't see the point. And I can directly relate that as someone who joined a union and organized to win certification, and we kind of stopped organizing after that, because that was kind of okay, we did it, we got the agreement, we got we have our shop stewards. Our stewards are there to like enforce the contract, but that's not how things worked. And anytime as a shop steward myself, I went to the staff rep and was told, oh, well, that's management rights, we can't do anything about that. We completely deflated. And just, nothing takes the wind out of anyone's sails faster than just saying like, oh yeah, that's just how it is, or they have the right to do that. There's nothing we can do. And I think, as someone who's experienced basically realizing that the worst thing we could do is do nothing, and that fighting was worth the consequences of not fighting, to me kind of is that direct connection to what tenants are facing and what renters can accomplish in terms of building that collective power. And for me, the biggest lesson and the biggest kind of connection between the two is that you have to do this for yourselves. No one's going to come in and make things better for you. No one's going to be the union for you. And so that's, to me, kind of like the bottom line. If we're walking away from this and wondering, what do we do? What's next? Do we have to you know, set up this kind of, you know, nonprofit tenant union or something like that. It's no, start talking to people, build those relationships, and get a committee set up, whether it's your workplace, your building, and start talking about what the issues are and what you can do about it. But also do try to find training on organizing, whether that's, you know, through a local tenants union or an organization like the IWW, or maybe that's, you know, those of us in labor unions who have, you know, an ability to kind of go back to our unions and say, hey, we need to actually be doing something about this. Let's take this idea of, you know, learning from each other and building each other's skills up to the next level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carrie. Any final thoughts on this that folks on the panel might want to share? Okay. Well, I mean, I'm seeing a question that feels like sort of a natural ending point, which is put very eloquently by Elle, I believe, which is, so what next? And I think that's something that you know, we didn't ask anyone to sort of come with. But I think it's important for us to think about so that these panels and these types of events just don't just end up being you know, a one-stop shop. That we try to connect this to the movements on the ground. So if anyone has anything they want to either plug or feel they want to direct people to, whether that's you know, as Carrie said, join your local tenant union, start building a committee in your building, start knocking on your neighbors' doors. You got no problems, that's fine. You reach out to an organizer maybe at one of these organizations and they can help. Reach out to us at Rent Strike Bargain. And again, just giving us a little plug if you're interested in helping further this idea that, you know, there should be more solidarity and work between tenants and labor, and you want to help push labor to take more housing stances, help organize your coworkers around the idea of housing, reach out to us. There's a form in the chat. But to our panelists, so what next? Does anyone have any thoughts?
I can go ahead and get out you all's way. Yeah, I think, you know, part of it, I guess more like in the theoretical, right, senses, you know, just I think understanding like the fight that we're up against, right? And I think here in the U.S., I mean, you know, obviously Trump was the big bad boogeyman, but we see Biden, you know, already not changing, you know, much policy-wise, right? In a lot of instances, you know, very quietly, you know, continuing with a lot of the same neoliberal policies that Obama did, but, you know, so yeah, I mean, I think, you know, understanding that, you know, this is a fight that we really have to, you know, understand, you know, who it is that we're up against and the tactics that they'll use, right? So I think, I remember one of the first tenant meetings that we had, you know, a lot of the folks who were in our group were like, they got really caught up in this legalese talk, right? Talking about the logistics and legal stuff. And I was just like, look, like when they start evicting folks, they're not going to be following the law. Like, so we have to understand, you know, what it is, who it is we're up against, and understanding, because I was bringing up like, you know, there's going to be some instances where they're moving people's stuff out and we're going to be moving them right back in as they're moving them out. Right. And, you know, folks were like, well, is that legal? And I was like, well, hey, they're going to be doing some illegal stuff. So like, we can't get caught up in that. Right. They can figure that out. We're going to move this person's stuff back into the house while they're, you know, figuring that out. So I think it's, you know, understand who it is that we're up against. And then, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, definitely talking to neighbors is very key. I think that's always where you start, talking to your coworkers. Oftentimes these are people who, you know, your coworkers, your neighbors, people you know, you trust, you know, some instances you all know each other's family, things like that, right? So I think that that's always where to start. And then from there, bringing in other folks who are, you know, down to fight for what you all need to get.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, John. Any other thoughts on what next? David, maybe if the New West Tenants Union's popping back up, if there's any New Westers on the call to reach out.
Yeah, I'm going to pop my email in the chat if anybody is living in New West and they want to get involved in talking to their neighbors. We, you know, in the past, we've organized about 10 buildings, and there's lots of work to do. Lots of people that are impacted by buyout campaigns and renovictions. And even with the renoviction bylaw here in New West, which is fairly groundbreaking, you know, landlords are pretty persistent, and so they're finding ways to do bad faith evictions and things like that. So we need to be organized too.
Thank you, David. Ferris, any final thoughts?
No, I think it was said really well. Yeah, talk to, if you're wanting to get into tenant organizing, talk to the people in your building. That's really what it comes down to. And also, don't be afraid to do it methodically. Like, have a spreadsheet of every unit. What was the conversation you had? Where are they at? Like, for example, rents are dropping right now where I am. So in my building, a really great organizing tool is an ad just went up for an apartment that's way cheaper than what any of us are paying. So this is an easy thing to go to my neighbors and be like, hey, they're advertising this. They're not letting any of us get the decrease. This is a great opportunity for us. How do you feel? Ask a lot of questions too. Really just take your time. Don't try to rush things. Don't tell people what to do, and just try it.
Thank you, Ferris. And last but certainly not least, Carrie, do you have any thoughts on what next?
I think I kind of said that in the last question, but I feel like everything everyone said, talk to people, build those connections. And I think just also recognizing that the issue of housing, the power dynamics at play, there's endless amounts of issues that we can look at and try to address. But I think, you know, the point is to start, and the point is to identify other people who want to do this, who want to fight this, and to support each other, because it's easy to start to feel overwhelmed and that, you know, you really can't make a difference. But every little step counts, and it's that first step to starting to organize that helps lead to those next steps and to bigger victories. And people are inspired by work being done all around the world, and what people are able to achieve, and through history to present day. And to just, I would strongly encourage folks to find those stories, find people who are willing and interested in taking this on, and to really just keep each other motivated, because it makes a huge difference, and we do have the power if we are united.
Wow, thank you so much. I think that is that's our final question there. I want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for making the time to come out today and talk to everyone. I really, really appreciate all the questions from the chat that folks put forward. And yeah, I'm just going to throw my own react. If anyone else wants to throw a little clap react, thank you so much. That those words were extremely wise, and I think there's a lot of really generous offers. Carrie both posted her email in the chat. So did David as well. So if you want to reach out to them about some of the work that's going on there, I think that would be incredible. I've also been asked to plug for the Vancouver Tenants Union, the Broadway Plan meeting that's coming up, which I'll post in the chat as well right after I posted our email, and that is that link. Oh, and John also put his email in the chat. Thank you so much, John, for joining us and for putting that in the chat. I don't think we have anything else, so thank you all. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and otherwise, I hope you have a lovely rest of your Sunday. Thank you for calling in.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.